A locked room, 2 mutilated bodies. What kind of crime could leave the police completely baffled? This is Midnight Corridor. Tonight we are going to read The Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. In the dimly lit streets of Paris, where the flickering gas lamps cast long shadows and the boundary between reason and madness grows thin, there existed a mind unlike any other, a mind capable of penetrating the deepest mysteries that baffled ordinary men. This was the mind of Chevalier Auguste Dupin, a name that would forever be etched in the annals of criminal investigation as the progenitor of all analytical detectives to come. Born to an illustrious family that had seen better days, Dupin was a creature of the night, a phantom of intellect who prowled the forgotten corners of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our first meeting occurred under the most peculiar circumstances, in an obscure library where we both sought the same rare volume. From that moment, an unbreakable bond formed between us, and I became the chronicler of his extraordinary exploits. Dupin's residence was a time-worn mansion of grotesque grandeur, its decaying splendor a perfect reflection of his own eccentric genius. There, amidst piles of books and the perpetual haze of tobacco smoke, he would spend his days in profound meditation, emerging only when the sun had set, to walk the labyrinthine streets of Paris, his sharp eyes missing nothing. What distinguished Dupin was not merely his power of observation, but his preternatural ability to reconstruct entire trains of thought from the barest fragments of evidence. I shall never forget the evening when, after 15 minutes of perfect silence, he suddenly interrupted my musings with the remark, "You are right about the epilogue. It would indeed be more effective in the minor key." He had deduced not only that I was thinking of the musical composition we had heard earlier, but had followed every twist and turn of my reflections upon it. This remarkable faculty, which he termed ratiocination, enabled him to solve problems that left the official police utterly confounded. While they bustled about collecting obvious clues, Dupin would sit motionless for hours, his mind working with the precision of a master watchmaker until the truth stood revealed before him in all its terrible simplicity. The Parisian police, with their crude methods and dogged adherence to routine, were a perpetual source of amusement to Dupin. "They collect facts," he would say, "but they cannot interpret them. They measure the shadow, but cannot calculate the substance that casts it." His contempt for their procedures was matched only by his pity for their limitations. Yet for all his brilliance, Dupin remained an enigma even to me, his closest companion. There were depths to his character that no plumb line could sound, moments when his eyes would take on a faraway look as if contemplating mysteries beyond mortal comprehension. It was in this old house, on a particularly gloomy autumn evening, with the wind howling through the chimney like a banshee, that Dupin first heard of the atrocities in the Rue Morgue, crimes so bizarre, so utterly beyond the pale of human behavior that they would test his analytical powers as never before. The newspapers called it impossible, the police declared it insoluble, but to Dupin it was simply another puzzle waiting to be unraveled. And so begins our tale, not with fanfare or flourish, but with the quiet certainty of a mind prepared to confront the inconceivable. For in that dreadful apartment on the Rue Morgue, where 2 women met their ghastly end, Auguste Dupin would demonstrate for the first time that no mystery, however baffling, can withstand the relentless application of pure reason. The ghastly affair of the Rue Morgue first came to public attention through the morning editions of the newspapers. I remember distinctly how the thick black headlines screamed of horrors beyond comprehension. Atrocious murders in the Rue Morgue, 2 women savagely slain. The very typeface seemed to tremble with the shock of the revelation. At number 41 Rue Morgue, on the 4th floor of an otherwise respectable boarding house, Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter Camille had met their dreadful end. The concierge, upon hearing terrible screams at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, had alerted several neighbors before summoning the police. When the officers forced entry, nearly an hour later, delayed by the apparent impossibility of opening the locked doors, they discovered a scene that would haunt even the most hardened investigators. The apartment presented a spectacle of devastation that defied all logic. Furniture lay shattered into kindling. A heavy bedstead broken to splinters, chairs reduced to fragments. In the center of this wreckage, the body of the younger woman, Mademoiselle Camille, was found thrust upside down into the narrow chimney flue, so violently wedged that it required 4 men to extract her. Her face and upper body bore terrible lacerations, as if some monstrous force had dragged her upward through the rough brick passage. But it was the condition of the elderly Madame L'Espanaye that truly turned strong men pale. She lay in the courtyard below, her neck so thoroughly severed that the head remained attached by mere shreds of flesh. The face was mutilated beyond recognition, deep gashes forming a grotesque pattern that suggested not mere murder, but some unspeakable ritual. Most horrifying of all, tufts of gray hair, torn violently from the scalp, were found clutched in her own stiffened fingers, as though she had ripped them out herself in her death agonies. The police investigation quickly descended into farce. Every theory proposed collapsed under scrutiny. The doors had been locked from within. The windows, though open, were utterly inaccessible from the street below. Neighbors testified to hearing 2 distinct voices during the attack, one unquestionably French, the other described variously as Spanish, Italian, or Russian by different witnesses. Most peculiar of all was the unanimous testimony regarding the shrill, unnatural quality of the French voice. "Not human," declared one witness. "Like nothing I've ever heard before," said another. The apartment's valuables remained untouched. Gold coins lay scattered on the floor, jewelry left in plain sight, yet nothing was taken. This eliminated robbery as a motive. The victims had no known enemies. Madame L'Espanaye was a recluse who lived solely for her daughter, while Camille's modest beauty had attracted no dangerous admirers. The coroner estimated the strength required to force Mademoiselle Camille up the chimney would have been superhuman, while the precision of Madame L'Espanaye's wounds suggested surgical skill. After 3 weeks of fruitless investigation, during which the newspapers daily invented new sensational theories, a secret lover, a political assassination, a madman escaped from Charenton, the prefect of police reluctantly admitted defeat. The case would join Paris's growing collection of unsolved mysteries, until Dupin, reading between the lines of the official reports, saw what others had missed. It was on a particularly gloomy afternoon, as rain lashed against our windows and the fire struggled to maintain its glow, that Dupin first expressed interest in the Rue Morgue atrocities. I had been reading aloud from the Gazette des Tribunaux, recounting the latest official statements about the case, when he suddenly raised a pale hand to silence me. "Read that section again," he commanded, his gray eyes gleaming with sudden intensity. "The part about the voices." I complied, rereading the testimony of the various witnesses who had heard the dreadful sounds from the murder apartment. When I finished, Dupin rose with unusual energy and began pacing before the fire, his shadow dancing grotesquely on the book-lined walls. "There is something here," he murmured, more to himself than to me, "something the fools have missed entirely." He stopped abruptly and fixed me with that penetrating gaze I had come to know so well. "We shall visit the Rue Morgue tomorrow." The following morning found us at the scene of the crime, Dupin having secured permission through channels I never fully understood. The apartment had been left largely undisturbed since the murders, a macabre museum of violence. Dupin moved through the rooms with the quiet intensity of a bloodhound, examining every detail, while I stood awkwardly near the door, unnerved by the lingering atmosphere of horror. For nearly 3 hours, he conducted his examination, at times crawling on hands and knees, at others, standing perfectly still for minutes at a time. He measured distances between objects, examined the angles of broken furniture, and even tasted, to my revulsion, some of the dried substances on the floor. The police had left chalk outlines where the bodies had been found. Dupin studied these with particular attention, frequently consulting a small notebook in which he made meticulous sketches. It was when he turned his attention to the windows that his investigation took its most dramatic turn. The apartment had 2 large casement windows opening onto the street below. These had been found open, but as they were nearly 20 feet above the pavement and lacked any nearby drain pipes or ledges, the police had dismissed them as possible points of entry or exit. Dupin, however, examined the windows with minute care. He tested their movement, measured their reach, and studied their fastenings. Suddenly, he gave a soft exclamation and beckoned me over. "Observe," he said, pointing to a small, almost imperceptible mark on the window latch. "Do you see it? The scratch here and the corresponding mark on the frame?" I confessed I could barely discern what he indicated. "Precisely," he cried, "which is why the police missed it entirely. These marks were made by a spring-loaded mechanism, a device designed to catch and hold when the window is closed with sufficient force. Our murderer entered and exited through this window." "But how?" I protested. "There's no possible way to reach it from outside." Dupin smiled enigmatically. "Come, we have seen enough here. There are other places I must examine." Our next stop was the morgue, where the bodies had been taken. Dupin spent nearly an hour examining the wounds, particularly those on Madame L'Espanaye's face and neck. He made careful notes about their shape, depth, and angle. The coroner, initially resistant to this civilian intrusion, became increasingly fascinated as Dupin pointed out details the professionals had overlooked. "The cuts on the neck," Dupin observed, "appear clean and precise at first glance, but notice how they actually consist of multiple overlapping strokes. The implement was extremely sharp, but wielded with remarkable irregularity, alternating between surgical precision and wild hacking. Most curious, equally intriguing to him, were the tufts of hair found in the old woman's hands. Under magnification, Dupin noted they had not been simply pulled out, but cut, and at different angles. She was not tearing out her own hair in anguish, he murmured, but having it cut from her head by something with unusual methods of holding scissors. Our final visit was to the newspaper offices, where Dupin pored through back issues, seeking any report of escaped animals or unusual thefts in the preceding months. It was here that he found what he later told me was the final piece of the puzzle, a small notice about a sailor from Malta who had reported the theft of an orangutan from his lodgings near the Rue Morgue. That evening, back in our rooms, Dupin sat smoking his meerschaum pipe, the blue wreaths of tobacco smoke curling about his head like the visible manifestations of his thoughts. At length, he laid out his conclusions with startling clarity. The murderer was not human, he stated calmly. It was an orangutan of the Bornean species, brought to Paris by a Maltese sailor. The creature escaped, entered through the window, which its remarkable agility allowed it to reach, and committed these atrocities with a razor it found in the apartment. I stared at him in utter disbelief, but he continued relentlessly, explaining each point with irrefutable logic. The superhuman strength needed to force the girl up the chimney, the inhuman quality of the voices reported, one being the sailor's, the other the ape's, the peculiar nature of the wounds matching an ape's use of tools, even the tufts of hair being cut by the razor rather than torn. "But how can you be certain of these details?" I stammered. Dupin smiled. "Because tomorrow we shall meet the sailor himself." The following morning, Dupin was unusually animated as he laid out his plan. "We must advertise," he declared, spreading open the pages of Le Monde, "but not in the usual fashion. Our notice must speak directly to our Maltese sailor without alerting others to our purpose." The advertisement he composed was a masterpiece of subtlety, found in the Bois de Boulogne. Early on the morning of the inquest stated, a very large orangutan of the Bornean breed. The owner, who is known to be a sailor belonging to a Maltese vessel, may have the animal again upon identifying it satisfactorily and paying a few charges connected with its capture and keeping. Apply at Rue au Troisième. Dupin explained his reasoning. The sailor will recognize his lost property, but the mention of the Bois de Boulogne, far from the Rue Morgue, will prevent any connection to the murders. The request for payment is crucial. It gives the appearance of legitimate business while ensuring his appearance. We took rooms under assumed names at the address given in the notice and waited. Dupin had arranged for 2 gendarmes to be stationed nearby, though they were instructed to remain out of sight unless summoned. He also secured a large net used by animal handlers, which we concealed behind a screen. 3 days passed without response, and I began to doubt the scheme. Then, on the 4th evening, just as dusk fell, we heard hesitant footsteps on the stairs. A knock followed, 3 quick raps, then 2 slower ones. Dupin motioned for me to remain silent as he opened the door. The man who stood there was exactly as he had predicted, a sailor of obvious Mediterranean origin, his skin weathered by tropical suns, his hands marked by rope burns. His eyes darted about nervously. "You have my ape?" he demanded, in heavily accented French. Dupin smiled pleasantly. "Come in, my friend. We have much to discuss." As the sailor stepped inside, Dupin quietly locked the door behind him and pocketed the key. What followed was one of the most extraordinary interrogations I have ever witnessed. Dupin began by showing the sailor a drawing he had made of an orangutan, watching carefully for recognition. When the man's eyes widened slightly, Dupin nodded. "You kept it in your lodgings near the Rue Morgue," he said conversationally. "A dangerous pet for a city dwelling." The sailor's face went ashen. "How do you know this?" Dupin ignored the question. "On the night of the murders, the beast escaped through your window, taking your razor with it. You gave chase, following it to the house where the women were killed." The sailor began to tremble violently. "I saw nothing. I heard screams, yes, but You heard," Dupin interrupted smoothly, "and you saw enough to know what had happened. Yet you did not come forward. Why? Because you feared being blamed for the murders yourself." With each statement, Dupin moved closer to the truth, presenting facts as if he had witnessed the events himself. The sailor, overwhelmed by this display of omniscience, collapsed into a chair. "God help me," he whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Dupin's manner softened slightly. "Tell us everything, and you have my word you will not be charged with the murders, but you must leave Paris tonight, and that animal must never again be brought to civilization." What emerged was a tale both pitiable and horrifying. The sailor, recently returned from Borneo, had brought the orangutan back as a curiosity. On the fateful night, the creature had become agitated by his attempts to shave it with the razor. In a frenzy, it had escaped through the window, with the sailor in pursuit. "I saw it climb to that apartment," the man confessed, tears streaming down his face. "I heard the women scream, but by the time I climbed up, it was too late. The old woman was already dead, and the young one," he shuddered. "The ape had her by the hair and was playing with the razor. When it saw me, it got frightened and shoved her up the chimney." Dupin nodded gravely. "And then?" "I chased it back to our rooms. It was covered in blood, still holding the razor. I managed to get it into its cage. The next day, I sold it to a menagerie outside the city." He looked up desperately. "I swear I didn't know those women. I never meant..." Dupin held up a hand. "We believe you, but you must leave France immediately. There is a ship sailing for Malta tomorrow at dawn. You will be on it." After obtaining a full written confession, which Dupin assured would remain sealed unless the man returned to Paris, we let the sailor go. The gendarmes, though clearly puzzled by these proceedings, honored their agreement to let him depart. When we were alone again, I turned to Dupin in amazement. "You're just letting him go?" Dupin lit his pipe calmly. "Justice has been served. The sailor is guilty of stupidity, not murder. The real killer, that unfortunate beast, is already imprisoned in a cage where it can do no further harm. As for the prefect and his men," he exhaled a smoke ring with satisfaction. "Let them puzzle over their unsolved case a while longer. It will do their brains good." As the embers in our fireplace dwindled to faint crimson glow, I found myself staring at Dupin in silent awe. The Rue Morgue affair had concluded with neither fanfare nor public resolution, yet its implications lingered like the tobacco smoke curling about our heads. "You've shown," I ventured at last, "that the boundary between man and beast is far thinner than we dare admit. That poor creature acted from instinct, yet produced horrors surpassing human malice." Dupin stirred from his reverie, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "More disturbing, perhaps, is how easily we dismiss what we cannot categorize. The police saw only impossibility where nature offered explanation. We cling to comfortable fictions rather than confront unsettling truths." He rose and moved to the window, where dawn's first light tinted the Parisian rooftops. A newspaper on the table caught his attention, a report about the mysterious disappearance of a young shopgirl named Marie Rogêt. And so, the case of the murders in the Rue Morgue is over, but Dupin's detective journey has just begun. Edgar Allan Poe didn't just create a mystery, He created a blueprint for every sleuth to come, from Sherlock Holmes to modern crime solvers. In our next episode, we will dive into The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, where Dupin tackles a crime without ever leaving his armchair. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss how the world's first detective cracks an unsolvable real-life murder. A real-life unsolved murder from history, a young life cut short, a body sinking into the icy Seine. The drowned may find rest in the riverbed's embrace, but when will the torrent of slander cease violating the dead's dignity? Hi, this is Midnight Corridor. Tonight we are going to read The Mystery of Marie Rogêt by Edgar Allan Poe. In the perpetual twilight of a Parisian autumn, where the dying light cast long shadows upon cobblestoned streets, there dwelt a man whose mind possessed an almost supernatural faculty for penetrating the veils of human deception. See Auguste Dupin, that enigmatic figure whose very name had become synonymous with the most profound analytical reasoning, sat in his chamber of contemplation, surrounded by the ephemeral whispers of newsprint and the spectral remnants of human tragedy. Before him lay scattered the daily chronicles of human folly and misfortune, newspapers bearing the weight of society's most perplexing mysteries. Among these lay the accounts of a case that would test even his extraordinary powers of deduction: the mysterious disappearance and tragic death of Marie Rogêt, a young woman of uncommon beauty whose fate had become the subject of intense public speculation and official bewilderment. The tale of Marie Rogêt possessed all the elements of a Gothic romance: beauty destroyed in its prime, love shrouded in secrecy, and death wearing the mask of inexplicable mystery. She had been, by all accounts, a creature of singular loveliness, one of those ethereal beings who seem to walk among mortals as if they were visitors from some more refined sphere of existence. Marie dwelt in the shadow of the great cathedral of Notre Dame, employed at a modest tobacco shop in the narrow Rue Saint-André des Arts. The establishment carried the earthy aroma of cured leaves that mingled perpetually with the urban symphony of carriage wheels and street vendors' cries. On that fateful Sunday morning of June 22, 1841, Marie informed her employer that she intended to visit her aunt who resided in the Rue des Drômes. The morning was one of those peculiarly oppressive days that sometimes descend upon Paris like a shroud, when the very air seems thick with unspoken portents and the shadows appear deeper than nature would ordinarily allow. 3 days after Marie's departure, 3 days that stretched like an eternity of foreboding, the Seine yielded up its terrible secret. A fisherman, plying his trade in the early morning hours when the mist still clung to the water's surface like the breath of the damned, discovered floating among the reeds the lifeless form of what had once been Paris's most celebrated beauty. Marie Rogêt is dead. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city's soul, as if the very foundations of civilized society had been shaken by some malevolent force. The newspapers, those chronicles of human misery and sensation, seized upon the story with the voracious appetite of carrion birds, each publication offering its own interpretation of the ghastly discovery. Dupin, reviewing the various newspaper accounts of that morning, noted with particular interest the contradictory nature of the testimonies surrounding Marie's departure. L'Etoile reported that she had seemed in unusually high spirits, while Le Moniteur suggested that witnesses had observed a certain pensiveness in her demeanor. Such contradictions, Dupin mused, were often more revealing than the most detailed eyewitness accounts, for they suggested the presence of those subtle deceptions that invariably accompany human tragedy. Le Moniteur Universel, in its characteristic tone of official solemnity, reported that the body had been found in a state of advanced decomposition, suggesting that death had occurred shortly after the victim's disappearance. The corpse, it noted with clinical detachment, bore evidence of violent struggle, the clothing torn to ribbons, some of which had been used to bind the limbs in a manner that spoke of deliberate concealment rather than random violence. La Presse, ever eager to sensationalize, painted a more lurid picture. The unfortunate young woman's garments were not merely torn, but appeared to have been systematically destroyed, as if by some fiend possessed of methodical malice. The very manner of the binding suggested knowledge of seamanship, leading investigators to suspect the involvement of rivermen or sailors. Yet Le Constitutionnel, offered a markedly different account, describing the knots as peculiar and unlike those commonly employed by maritime professionals, and suggesting instead the work of someone attempting to create the false impression of nautical involvement. Dupin, his pale fingers tracing the lines of newsprint as if they were sacred runes, noted these discrepancies with the keen interest of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. In his experience, such contradictions were not mere journalistic incompetence, but rather the inevitable result of witnesses filtering truth through the distorting lens of their own expectations and fears. L'Étoile provided what it claimed was the most comprehensive account of the crime scene. The deceased was discovered partially submerged among the rushes, her long dark hair streaming like seaweed in the current. About her throat were visible the livid marks of manual strangulation, while her countenance bore the unmistakable expression of one who had experienced the ultimate terror. The same publication noted that several articles of male clothing had been found in the vicinity, fragments of fine cloth that suggested a gentleman's attire. This detail, seemingly insignificant to the casual observer, struck Dupin as profoundly meaningful. If the crime had indeed been committed by a gang of ruffians, as the police theorized, why would evidence point to a single, well-dressed assailant? Le Moniteur reported another curious detail. Marie's bonnet had been discovered some distance from the body, hanging from a thorn bush, as if deliberately placed rather than lost in struggle. The ribbon that had secured it showed no signs of violent removal, but rather appeared to have been carefully untied. As Dupin absorbed these varied accounts, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across his aquiline features, he began to perceive the emergence of a pattern, not in what the newspapers reported, but in what they consistently failed to address. The official investigation, he realized, had been fundamentally misdirected from its very inception. In the days that followed the grim discovery, Paris became a city possessed by speculation and rumor. Every café, every salon, every gathering place resonated with theories as numerous as the stones in Père Lachaise cemetery. Yet, amidst this cacophony of conjecture, Dupin observed with growing fascination how the very abundance of testimony served only to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. Dupin, his analytical mind dissecting these contradictions with surgical precision, recognized in them the hallmarks of manufactured testimony. No genuine witness, he reflected, could produce such wildly divergent accounts unless influenced by external forces. Either Madame de Luc was deliberately providing false information, or she had become the victim of suggestion and coercion. This revelation, if true, would fundamentally alter the nature of the crime. No longer could it be dismissed as a random act of violence perpetrated by waterfront ruffians. Instead, it suggested the possibility of a crime passionnel, that most Gothic of human tragedies, where love and death become inextricably intertwined. L'Étoile, in its continued coverage of the case, published what it claimed was a comprehensive timeline of Marie's final day. According to their investigation, she had left her employer's establishment at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, stating her intention to visit her aunt in the Rue des Drômes. However, when authorities questioned the aunt, she denied any expectation of Marie's visit and insisted that her niece had not appeared at her residence. This discrepancy, seemingly minor, held profound implications. If Marie had not intended to visit her aunt, then her stated purpose had been deliberately deceptive. The question that naturally arose was, whom had she truly intended to meet, and why had she felt compelled to conceal her true destination? Le Moniteur reported that several witnesses claimed to have seen Marie in the company of various individuals throughout that fateful day, but these sightings were so contradictory as to be mutually exclusive. One witness placed her at a riverside cafe at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while another insisted she had been observed at the Palais Royal at precisely the same hour. A third claimed to have seen her boarding an omnibus bound for the suburbs, while a fourth swore she had been walking alone along the quays. As Dupin contemplated these impossible testimonies, he began to perceive the emergence of a darker pattern. It appeared that someone had taken considerable care to ensure that Marie's final movements would be obscured by a web of conflicting accounts. This suggested not random violence, but calculated premeditation. The work of someone intimately familiar with the power of false testimony to misdirect official investigation. In the sepulchral silence of his chamber, Surrounded by the accumulated testimonies of human fallibility and official incompetence, Dupin began the delicate process of constructing truth from the fragments of deception. Like an archaeologist piecing together an ancient vase from scattered shards, he understood that the complete picture would emerge not from any single piece of evidence, but from the careful arrangement of seemingly unrelated details. The prevailing theory, enthusiastically embraced by the prefecture of police and echoed throughout the popular press, held that Marie Rogêt had fallen victim to a gang of riverside criminals, rough men who had seized upon her beauty as an opportunity for both pleasure and profit. This theory possessed the appealing simplicity that bureaucratic minds find so comforting. It required no complex investigation into Marie's private life, no delicate inquiries into the secrets of respectable society, no uncomfortable questions about the hidden connections between victim and perpetrator. Yet Dupin, with his characteristic penetration, perceived in this very simplicity the hallmark of intellectual laziness. The theory of gang violence, he noted, failed to account for numerous crucial details that had emerged from the various newspaper accounts. If Marie had indeed been attacked by multiple assailants bent on robbery and worse, why had her jewelry remained untouched? If the crime had been committed by waterfront ruffians, why did the physical evidence point to someone familiar with the victim's habits and movements? L'Étoile had reported that Marie's reticule, containing several gold coins and a small diamond brooch, had been found intact near her body. No desperate criminal, Dupin reasoned, would have overlooked such easily portable wealth. This detail alone suggested that robbery had not been the motive, that something far more personal and complex had driven the perpetrator to murder. The manner of Marie's death, as described in the various medical reports published by the press, provided additional clues to the discerning mind. Le Moniteur had noted that death appeared to have resulted from manual strangulation, with the marks upon the throat suggesting the grip of a single pair of hands rather than the multiple assaults one would expect from gang violence. The positioning of these marks, furthermore, indicated that the killer had faced his victim during the struggle, an intimate and personal method of murder that spoke of passion rather than random brutality. La Presse had published the observations of the examining physician, who noted that Marie's fingernails bore traces of human skin and blood, evidence that she had fought desperately against her attacker. Yet the pattern of these defensive wounds suggested a prolonged struggle with a single adversary rather than the quick, overwhelming assault that would characterize an attack by multiple criminals. Perhaps most significantly, the location where Marie's body was discovered provided crucial insights into the nature of her killer. The spot, a secluded bend in the Seine, some distance from the main thoroughfares, was not the sort of place frequented by casual criminals or waterfront gangs. It was, rather, a location that someone familiar with Marie's habits might have chosen for a private meeting, a trysting place known to both victim and perpetrator. Le Constitutionnel had noted that the area where Marie was found showed signs of a prolonged presence. The grass was trampled in a pattern suggesting that two people had remained there for some time before the fatal struggle began. This detail painted a picture not of sudden violence, but of a meeting that had turned deadly. Perhaps when conversation had given way to argument, and argument to irrevocable action. The systematic attempt to obscure Marie's identity and movements, evidenced by the contradictory witness testimonies, suggested a killer who understood the importance of misdirection in avoiding detection. This was not the crude work of common criminals, but the calculated effort of someone possessed of intelligence and social understanding, someone who moved in respectable society and understood how to manipulate its prejudices and assumptions. As these various threads began to weave themselves into a coherent pattern, Dupin felt the familiar thrill of approaching revelation. The truth, he realized, lay not in the sensational theories promulgated by the press, but in the careful analysis of what had been deliberately concealed and systematically distorted. The chamber seemed to grow colder as Dupin's deductions took shape. His fingers traced the edges of the scattered newspapers, each containing fragments of the truth, or perhaps deliberate falsehoods. "Observe," he murmured, his voice barely disturbing the thick silence, "how the evidence arranges itself into two distinct narratives. The newspapers would have us believe in a gang of waterfront ruffians, yet the very contradictions in their accounts betray the fragility of this theory." He lifted a single sheet of newsprint toward the guttering candlelight. The bonnet carefully hung upon a thorn bush, the peculiar knots, not those of sailors but someone imitating sailors, the untouched jewelry, each detail whispers a different story than what the prefecture proclaims. The chamber seemed to grow colder as Dupin's deductions crystallized into certainty. His long fingers, pale as the wax dripping from the guttering candle, arranged the scattered newspapers into a damning pattern upon the table. He declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through cobwebs, how every contradiction in these accounts points unerringly to one conclusion. The peculiar knots, unmistakably the work of a naval man, though clumsily disguised. The fine wool fragments from an officer's frock coat, the location, known only to Marie and her paramour, that recently returned lieutenant of the Navy whose name appears in no newspaper, yet whose presence haunts every line of these reports like a ghost at a séance. Yet, even as he spoke, his voice carried a peculiar hesitation. And yet the matter remains imperfect. Without the boat, that crucial missing vessel which must have carried Marie's body to its resting place, our conclusions must remain in the realm of conjecture. The firelight cast his shadow, elongated and wavering, across the volumes of criminal cases that lined his walls. We may reconstruct the tragedy thus. A lover's quarrel turned fatal, a panicked attempt to disguise the crime, influential hands steering the investigation away from certain quarters. But the final proof, his hand made an empty gesture in the air. The final proof remains as elusive as the morning mist upon the Seine. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the Parisian rooftops. The case of Marie Rogêt would join those other unresolved mysteries that haunted the city's collective memory, its truth, perhaps, known to a select few, but never to be openly acknowledged. Dupin extinguished the candle, its last wisp of smoke curling upward like a question mark in the gray morning light. Some puzzles, it seemed, were destined to remain unsolved, their answers lost between what could be proven and what the powerful would permit to be known. Till now, the mystery of Marie Rogêt remains, a puzzle without answers, a truth forever out of reach. Edgar Allan Poe didn't just invent detective fiction, he exposed an uncomfortable truth. Some doors remain closed, some names stay unspoken, some crimes are simply allowed to happen. Next time, we'll face an even darker question. What happens when the perfect crime isn't solved because no one wants it to be? The case of the Purloined Letter awaits. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Make sure you won't miss the next case. A single parchment bears the awful weight of toppling thrones, mere tracings of ink holding power to unmake regimes, its fatal secret keeping monarchs in gilded thrall, its potency drawn not from words, but from the very aorta of power. While gendarmes rend asunder gilded chambers in their blind scour, does the deadliest secret not smirk at us all from its brazen perch in the light? Hi, this is Midnight Corridor. Tonight, we are going to read The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe. The autumn wind clawed at the windows of our third-floor sanctuary like a restless spirit denied entry. Within Dupin's book closet, a chamber more tomb than library, its walls lined with the leather-bound relics of forgotten philosophies, the fire spat embers onto the hearthstone as if defying the coming winter. See, Auguste Dupin sat motionless in his favorite armchair, his cadaverous face half illuminated by the guttering flames, the smoke from his meerschaum pipe curling about his brow like a laurel wreath woven from ghosts. Our peaceful contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Monsieur G., the prefect of the Parisian police, whose heavy footsteps upon the narrow staircase announced his presence long before his actual appearance. The prefect was a man of perhaps 50 years, corpulent and florid, with an air of self-importance that barely concealed his underlying insecurity when confronted with problems that defied conventional investigation. "Ah, Dupin," he exclaimed upon entering our chamber, "I have come to consult you upon a matter of the utmost delicacy and importance, a case that has baffled my entire department and threatens to compromise the very foundations of governmental security." Dupin's pale eyes shifted almost imperceptibly toward our visitor, betraying neither surprise nor particular interest. "Pray be seated, my dear prefect," he replied with that characteristic calm that marked all his dealings with the official world. "I perceive that you are troubled by some matter of unusual complexity." The prefect settled his considerable bulk into the offered chair with obvious relief, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief despite the coolness of the evening. "The matter," he began, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "concerns the theft of a document of the most sensitive nature, a letter whose contents, were they to be revealed publicly, would precipitate a scandal of unimaginable proportions." He paused, as if gathering courage for the revelations that were to follow. "The letter was stolen from the royal apartments under circumstances so audacious. The thief is known to us. It is Minister D, a gentleman of considerable political influence. The letter," he continued, "was lying upon a table in the royal apartments when Minister D arrived for what appeared to be a routine consultation. The personage from whom it was taken, and I dare not speak more specifically of their identity, was engaged in reading another document when the minister's arrival was announced. In the haste to conceal this second letter, the first was inadvertently left exposed upon the table. Minister D, with that penetrating intellect for which he was renowned, had immediately perceived the significance of the exposed document. In a moment of inspiration that bordered upon the diabolical, he had conceived and executed a plan of such audacious simplicity that it defied comprehension. The minister," the prefect explained, "affected not to notice the letter while engaging in conversation upon matters of state, but when he rose to take his leave, he carelessly placed a letter of his own upon the table. In the confusion of his departure, he managed to substitute his worthless correspondence for the valuable document, accomplishing the theft while maintaining the facade of casual social intercourse. And now," the prefect concluded with obvious frustration, "Minister D possesses a document that grants him power beyond the dreams of ordinary ambition. He has not yet chosen to employ this weapon, but its mere existence serves as a constant threat to the stability of our government. The letter has become a sword of Damocles, suspended over the heads of those who dare not move against its possessor." The prefect's recitation of his department's investigative efforts revealed the tragic futility of conventional methodology when confronted with a criminal mind of exceptional sophistication. For 3 months, his most skilled operatives had employed every technique known to the science of detection, yet their quarry remained as elusive as the shadows that danced upon our chamber walls. "We have searched," the prefect declared, his voice heavy with the weight of professional humiliation, "with a thoroughness that would have uncovered the needle in the proverbial haystack. We have examined every square inch of the minister's hotel, applying the most rigorous scientific principles to our investigation. We have divided the premises into registered compartments, which we numbered so that none might be overlooked. The methodology employed by the police had been exhaustive in its scope and meticulous in its execution. They had taken the entire building, room by room, devoting the nights of a whole week to each. They had examined the furniture of each apartment, opening every possible drawer, and had not only opened every book, but had turned over every leaf in each volume. We measured the thickness of every book cover," the prefect continued. "Had any of the bindings been recently meddled with, it would have been utterly impossible that the fact should have escaped observation. Their search had extended to every conceivable hiding place. The investigation had not been confined to the minister's residence. His person had been subjected to the most rigorous scrutiny whenever opportunity presented itself. The police had arranged for him to be waylaid by footpads, as if by accident, and his pockets had been searched under their own inspection. They had even employed female agents to examine his person when he frequented certain salons where such liberties might be taken without exciting suspicion. We have examined the chair cushions with the finest long needles," the prefect continued, his voice rising in exasperation. "We have taken up the boards from the tabletops and have removed the tops of the tables themselves. We have left no stone unturned in our determination to recover this accursed document. Yet despite these Herculean efforts, the letter remained as elusive as if it had never existed. The minister's behavior throughout this ordeal had been exquisitely galling. Far from displaying the anxiety that might be expected of a man whose premises were under constant surveillance, he had maintained an attitude of perfect composure, even seeming to derive amusement from the obvious frustration of his pursuers. The minister," the prefect admitted with obvious reluctance, "has been perfectly aware of our nocturnal examinations. He has afforded us every facility for our searches and has even gone so far as to express his sympathy for our professional difficulties. The minister's calm assurance suggested either complete innocence or a hiding place so secure that discovery was impossible. In the profound silence that followed the prefect's recitation of his department's failures, Dupin remained motionless, his pale features betraying no emotion save for the slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated his interest. "Perhaps the mystery is a little too plain," Dupin observed at length, his voice carrying that peculiar quality of quiet certainty that characterized his most profound insights. What was it the French police chief said when he was asked why he had failed to find the stolen letter? "It is because it is so simple that one cannot see it." "Consider," he said, his voice gaining momentum as his analysis deepened, "the character of Minister D. He is not merely a politician of ordinary cunning, but a man whose intellect combines the precision of mathematical reasoning with the intuitive leaps of poetic inspiration. He is both logician and artist, both scientist and philosopher. Such a mind does not operate according to the crude principles that govern common criminality." The detective's analysis penetrated to the very heart of the intellectual warfare being waged between the minister and his pursuers. "The minister has studied your methods, anticipated your strategies, and chosen his approach precisely because he understood that you would seek the complex and overlook the simple. He has turned your own thoroughness against you, using your systematic nature as a weapon in his psychological arsenal." Dupin's exposition revealed the fundamental error in the police approach. They had assumed that a man of Minister D's intellectual caliber would resort to elaborate concealment methods, and they had therefore concentrated their efforts upon discovering some ingenious hiding place. "The principle of concealment," Dupin explained, "does not necessarily depend upon the ingenuity of the hiding place, but upon the psychology of the searcher. A document hidden in the most obvious location may be more secure than one concealed in the most elaborate secret compartment, provided that the searcher's expectations can be properly manipulated." To illustrate his point, Dupin described the mathematical principle underlying games of chance, where the player who understands the psychological tendencies of his opponents can manipulate their expectations to his advantage. A child playing at hiding will often choose the most obvious location, reasoning correctly that the sophisticated adult will search everywhere except the place that seems too simple to be considered. "Minister D," Dupin continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute logical certainty, "has applied this principle with consummate skill. He has reasoned that the police, trained to discover the concealed, would never think to examine closely that which appears ordinary and commonplace. He has transformed the letter into its own perfect disguise. The more systematically the police search for a hidden object, the more likely they are to overlook an object that is hiding in plain sight." 3 weeks later, when autumn's fingers had stripped the last leaves from Rue trees, the prefect returned, his waistcoat straining over new folds of frustration. This time, no cheerful greeting preceded him. Instead, his knuckles rapped a staccato of desperation upon our door. Dupin, ensconced in his armchair like a spider at the center of its web, did not rise. The firelight carved his profile into something skeletal, his fingers steepled before his lips, as if in prayer, or perhaps in preparation for an execution. "You have it," the prefect gasped, his jowls quivering. "The letter, you've recovered it?" Dupin's smile was a scalpel's edge. "My dear prefect, it was merely waiting for eyes willing to see what lay beneath the skin of the obvious." Dupin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Consider the minister's mind, a mind both poet and mathematician. Where would such a man hide a letter? Not in some contrived compartment, but in the one place your men would never think to look. The unbearable obviousness of daylight." He gestured to the mantelpiece, a card rack dangling by a filthy ribbon cluttered with trivial correspondence. The perfect hiding place, because it was no hiding place at all. The letter was there all along, disguised as refuse, torn, soiled, addressed in a woman's hand, a masterpiece of misdirection. The prefect's face slackened. "But the searches, we measured every book, probed every cushion, precisely," Dupin murmured. "You sought complexity where there was only simplicity. The minister knew you would." "And how did you retrieve it?" I asked. Dupin's eyes gleamed. "By turning his own tactics against him. I called upon the minister under pretext of discussing rare manuscripts. His arrogance was his undoing. He left the letter in that rack, confident no one would see it for what it was. He produced the purloined document from his breast pocket, its edges faintly charred as if held too close to hellfire. When a commotion erupted in the street, a staged affair of course, the minister rushed to the window. 5 seconds. That was all it took to replace his treasure with my own creation. The facsimile had been flawless in every visible particular, save one. You left something in its place, I realized. Dupin's smile widened. A letter within a letter. The outer shell matched the minister's disguise perfectly, but inside, he unfolded a single sheet. Upon it, in his own precise hand, lay the damning line from Crébillot. Un dessein si funeste, s'il n'est digne d'être, est digne de tieste. Atreus and Thyestes, Dupin murmured. The minister will understand the reference and remember Vienna. The prefect blinked. Vienna? Where he once did me a discourtesy, Dupin said softly. I told him then I would remember it. This is that remembrance. The prefect clutched the recovered letter like a holy relic, and the minister, when he discovers the substitution, will say nothing, Dupin interrupted. To admit the deception is to admit his defeat. Dupin smiled. It was a lesson in humiliation. By leaving my mark, I proclaimed that I penetrated not just his hiding place, but his very mind. The minister will spend sleepless nights wondering when our roles reversed, when the spider became the fly. And so closes the final case of C. Auguste Dupin, the grand architect of deduction, whose intellect cut through the veils of deception, laying bare the skeleton of truth where others saw only shadows. In this, his last triumph, he gifted the world something far greater than a solution, the very blueprint of modern detection. Now we turn the page. What mystery shall we share next? Remember to subscribe lest you miss when the next enigma bleeds through the parchment.